So before we talk about writing the discussion section for your proposal paper, talk about what it looks like in a completed research paper where you've actually gone and collected data, analyzed those data, and have results to talk about, right? Or you'd have a results section where you're reporting statistical information, right? So in a complete paper where you have data to talk about in the previous section, you would then explain the results again, which you already talked about in the results section. Now you'd explain what you found, the pattern of results, in plain English, right? So when you're in the results section, you're talking about the mean score on this was statistically higher than the mean score on this group of scores, right? You're talking very much at the score level. You're talking about numbers and mean differences and correlations and things like that. Whereas in the discussion section, you're saying that same information, but more at kind of a construct level. So if, instead of saying there was a mean difference in scores on the BDI, in the discussion you say one group reported being less depressed than the other group, right? Or there was less depression noted in this group than that group, right? So plain English. Still professional language, but not any kind of statistical jargon in the discussion section. And you want to comment on the degree to which your hypothesis or hypotheses were supported, right? And often you're in a large study, you're doing multiple analyses, and not all of the results will fall in line with what you expect them to be. And so you talk about consistent with expectations, we found this, this, and this. However, we failed to document a relationship between this and this, or failed to find the expected difference between this group and this group on this particular variable. Right? So you talk about, again, restating the pattern of results here, but relating it to what you expected to happen. Okay? And then you're also in the discussion section going to be relating this pattern of findings to previous findings in theory, which are things you've probably talked about back in the introduction section already to kind of set up your study about why you expect to find what you are looking at. But now you say, we found this, and this is consistent with so-and-so's. It's different than so-and-so study, and the reason we got different findings is this. We're looking at different people, we're measuring it a different way, they were just wrong, whatever it is. You explain any kind of discrepancies with previous research or discrepancies with theory. And sometimes you might suggest the need to modify a theory. The theory that is applicable here suggests that this should happen, and that didn't happen. We found the opposite, which suggests that the theory isn't always true. There's this sometimes, for some people, it's not true, and so you need to modify the theory to encompass these latest findings. Right? So once you've done that, you address aspects of the study that limit the validity of the findings, addressing both internal validity and external validity. Right? So we found this difference, we found this relationship, whatever, and then you say, okay, however, our confidence that this difference is true and accurate, right, which is internal validity, or that this relationship truly exists, may be limited because of this. And usually it's not something that you did on purpose. And it's not just a mistake. You mean, oh, we really screwed this up, but something where because of limited resources you weren't able to do. So you didn't have enough money to have enough participants, or it might be just some limitations in the field of knowledge you're looking at, where we think this study documents this thing affects this other thing, but the measure we use to measure the dependent variable has unknown psychometric properties, because there are no existing measures with good psychometric properties to measure this variable. It's something that's very hard to measure, maybe, right? So some reasons why, okay, we think we found this, but reasons we might be wrong, and here they are, right? And then for external validity, we think we found this, and we think it's true, but it might not be true for everybody, or for people whose experiences are different from those exactly in this study, and here's why. Right? And if you can, when you're addressing those limitations, you always say, you try to counter your own doubting. Like, it's almost like you're debating yourself. Well, here's this limitation, but that limitation probably has little effect because we did this, right? We addressed that limitation already, or because it's not important in this study to generalize to other people, and other studies need to do that. So you address that. And then generally after that, you come back with, well, despite these limitations, and then you identify potential applications for the findings. So we found this, and so people should now go do this. People should live their lives differently this way. Right? Therapists should do this, firefighters should do this, whatever. You make some recommendations about what people should do differently based on what you found. Right? And usually the last thing in most research articles at the end of the discussion section will be some suggestion for the next step in research. So, given what we found, future studies should concentrate on blah, blah, blah. And often this is tied back into limitations. Right? So if one of the limitations is we need to find that if this effect applies to this other group of people, then future research should look at whether or not this finding can be replicated in people who blah, 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 whatever this other group is. Okay. Now, in the proposal, a lot of overlap, but it's obviously going to be a little different because you don't have findings, and you're not going to make up numbers. Right? You're not going to make up a results section. You have a data analysis plan. We talk about how you're going to analyze the data, how you would analyze the data, and what the expected pattern of results is. And then in a discussion section, you're going to do that same kind of thing, but instead of talking about explaining the pattern of results, you're explaining the expected pattern of results in plain English. So again, the same thing. You're talking at the construct level here. Because you're talking about it's expected that blah, 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 you don't have to relate it to your hypothesis, because by saying it's expected, we know it's your hypothesis. But you do need to relate it back to kind of the reasons for the expectation, which is usually theory and research. And you don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this because you've done this already in instruction. You've set up these arguments for why you expect to find what you expect to find. So in the discussion being, it's expected that this A will be related to B. This expectation is based on this would be consistent with so-and-so's theory of blah, blah, or this would be consistent with so-and-so's findings that blah, 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 whatever somebody else found that lends support or credence to your expectations, right? So you kind of briefly reference that. You don't have to go into detail about this theory or this other study or studies that are supporting your hypothesis, but just kind of mention them again because you've already talked about them in depth back in the introduction section. Okay, so briefly relating back to the reasons for the expectation, reasons for the hypothesis, and then in the proposal, the bulk of your stuff is going to be about limitations and implications. So in terms of limitations, two things to think about. One, the generalization of conclusions based on the expected pattern of results might be limited by. So this is basically saying, okay, imagining if I find exactly what I say I'm going to find, right? Because I've just talked about the expected pattern of findings in the previous paragraph, probably, right? It's expected that blah, 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 blah. If we find this, it might not mean that this therapy is better than this therapy. Let's say you're comparing therapies. And then you talk about why that might be, right? So this is basically we're talking about kind of threats to internal validity that might limit your conclusions, the validity of your conclusions, right? So we're not able to generalize conclusions because, well, we didn't measure this exactly right or whatever. You can address all that stuff. Anything that you think is a threat to internal validity. But you can also say, well, the conclusions might not be generalizable, not because they're not accurate and true for the study, but because the people in our study are so unique, or the things they did in the study are so unique or so artificial that it won't generalize to other people or other situations, right? So now we're talking about external validity. Right? So if I find what I think I should find, it might not be true because of yada yada, or it might not be true for everyone because of yada yada. And you talk about the limitations. The one thing, when you're writing about limitations in your proposal, it's never going to be sufficient to say one limitation of a study is a small sample size. Why? Why is that a limitation? So in what way does that limit the validity or the generalization of your findings? You have to talk about why. And generally, small sample size limits the power to find an effect or relationship, and it also limits the external validity. So it limits your ability to generalize to other people. So you have to spell that out. Why is something a limitation? Not just say, oh, it is a limitation. You have to clarify the logic behind why, what limits does it set, right? Okay. Second thing, so now first we talked about kind of if we find what we expect to find. It might not mean what we say it means. Here's why. The second thing is we might not find the expected pattern results. Right? We've talked about what that expected pattern is. However, we may not find it, even if it's true. This is kind of, we just always assume that we're right. Right? And the proposal, you say, well, you know, I'm proposing that this therapy will be superior to this one. That may not be observed because, and then you can talk about why you may not find an effect, or you may not find a relationship. And again, these are still going to be limitations. And you can talk about what it is that either part of your design or what participants might do or what experimenters might do during the course of the study that would prevent you from realizing a statistically significant effect or relationship. Just don't use the terms statistically significant in the discussion section. Okay, so after you've addressed the limitations, you want to address the implications and applications, potential ones, of your findings, right? So, and generally this is again where you go, despite the limitations, and here's where you go back to, swing the pendulum back to, if we find what we expect to find. So, if the expected pattern of findings is observed, then people should do this, right? Doctors should start doing this instead of this. Parents should do this instead of this. Right? And it's all based on your expected pattern of findings. Okay. And then